An Introduction to the American Short Story and American Poetry. Why study and write short stories and poetry? Research shows the following. Reading good literature, like short stories and poetry, leads to better understanding of and empathy with others. Exposure to good literature improves the ability to read, study, and learn in general, because with reading fiction and poetry, we are not simply searching for and repeating information. We are forced to examine details, to analyze while suspending judgment, to examine our own bases of knowledge and value systems, and to draw conclusions about questions which may have more than one pertinent point of view, and more than one valid answer. The capacity to read and appreciate stories, poems, and other literature enables us to explore different points of view and to have more complete lives. As adults, we will need not only practical skills, but the ability to serve as functional, contributory members of society, to work with other people, to listen to their stories and understand how their experiences have influenced preconceptions, attitudes, and reactions, much as our own stories influence our perceptions and decisions. Reading and writing, or writing about, short stories and poetry hones critical thinking skills, including analysis, taking the text apart, synthesis, combining text with our own perceptions, or creating mashups or combinations of texts, and considering other perspectives. As humans, we can read, write, and write about good literature. But you are not only students, storytellers, or poets. You are a story. We all are our own stories. When people get together to talk about themselves, about others, about life, the conversations are all story, all memories, all those little moments that, in looking back, seemed to make up our lives. Storytelling and poetry have long roots in the oral and pictographic history of the world, grand traditions that have been continued throughout traceable history. The fables, myths, stories, and verse that were passed on from one generation to the next helped reinforce desired social values and preserve bits of wisdom or humor acquired as human society progressed. While less transportable than wordless circus-style productions, performance artists, bards, minstrels, and griots brought spoken-word stories, sketches, and dramas to neighborhoods and communities throughout their regions, and stories and tales slowly crossed linguistic and cultural barriers as civilization expanded. America, being a melting pot of many cultures, races, and languages, historically enjoyed infusions of many storytelling traditions as immigrants integrated the heritage of their homelands with the language, trends, and realities of living in the United States. Like jazz music, the American short story was forged in the crucible of challenge, change, and the quest for freedom. After the Civil War, with continual large influxes of families seeking better lives for themselves, the United States was a nation of people constantly on the move, from one town to the next, from one opportunity to the next. The modern American short story grew from necessity rather than luxury. Folks on the move couldn't carry large libraries of books with them, nor could they follow the type of serial novel that was developing in magazines and newspapers across Europe. People needed a self-contained story that they could read in one sitting. Newspapers and magazines needed the stories to fit into the limited space they had available for printing. authors needed short-form outlets which could augment their income and allow them to survive while they worked on longer-form novels. Publishers found a nationwide audience of Americans which sought new short fiction on a weekly or monthly basis. The American frontier, the unruly dramas of the theatrical stage and of real politics. Even the first local to regional broadcasts of radio drama all played a part in the evolution of the short fiction form. In the melting pot of so many thousands of short stories available for reading, writers learned very quickly to hone their craft. From the common denominators of themes of personal identity, of explorations of the human in crisis, authors developed elements of style and expressions as unmistakable as fingerprints, with which they crafted stories so uniquely their own that attentive readers could often recognize writers without an author byline. And for the casual reader, fame sufficed to promote the popularity of authors and their stories. Writing in America had found a popular niche which lasted until the 1980s and 1990s, the lapse of interest in literature possibly coinciding with greater accessibility of immersive personal entertainment, such as the MTV story-form music videos, personal music players, video arcade, and early forms of computer gaming, and the explosion of serial and movie entertainment on dedicated television networks like HBO, and the more global smorgasbord available on servers like YouTube. But, writing almost a century before reading was relegated to an upper shelf in favor of full-color live-action entertainment, two American authors, Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, helped create the two distinct strains of short stories that tend to divide authors and writing even today. Poe, particularly, is credited with refining, if not inventing, the highly atmospheric, tightly constructed brevity of the American short story in the mid-19th century. Seeing the short story as different from the novella and the novel in intention, focus, and form, as well as in length, Poe, sometimes called the master of the horror story, tended to write stories viewed as art, leading the way to experimental and avant-garde styles of writing. Hawthorne's stories veered more towards entertainment and laid the foundations for pulp, true crime and noir, adventure, romance, and even comedic writing today. While the expense of printing and distribution and the lack of profits may have slowed the publication of the short story and other literary forms for a decade or two, the accessibility of the Internet has enabled a resurgence and renewed evolution of the contemporary short fiction form, which may extend well into the future. A 10-penny magazine, delivered nationwide, may no longer suffice to provide a sense of the American literary form. The United States, like the world, is constantly changing. In the restless currents of these days, no single story, poem, or form could appropriately be called quintessentially American. Contemporary America is comprised of countless individual tales and experiences, shaping a complex and ever-evolving whole. Once again, themes of personal identity, of personal quests which shape an individual's sense of self and relationship to others and the world, are enabling the short story to carve a foothold for itself, especially among people who value the stimulation of imagination and thought required to read, to understand, and to communicate, to find yourself, to borrow a phrase from John Steinbeck, through the written word. Creative literature is fiction. It thrives in the realms of fantasy and possibility. It's a what-if life. The question is not, did it happen? It is, did it convince you? Did it hold you until the end? Did you like it? Rather than, is it true? If all other things happen, if you read it, like it, remember it, dream about it, in a way it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. People have been writing about stories and the nature of stories for thousands of years. Plato felt that human art and writing represented truth, but were inferior to philosophy, which directly considers ideas and ideals and not interpretations of the truth. Aristotle felt that imitation of the truth is natural, and that artists and writers impart their individual truths through their art, and that, though the finished product may not represent a new reality or a new truth, it is indeed a new perception of reality, of truth as we know it. Some stories become popular myths or folk tales of local lore, but great storytellers, from Homer to Shakespeare to modern writers, have created characters and stories that resonate across different cultures, languages, and centuries. Several writers and literary critics, including Foster Harris, Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch, Ronald B. Tobias, Nancy Kress, Christopher Booker, Algis Burdiss, and Kurt Vonnegut have postulated that there are 7 or 9 or more basic plots that our universe of human writers have used, with personal variations, throughout history. While this somewhat reductionist approach tends to create the impression that all stories are more or less the same, it is useful from the perspective of literary criticism, and from the point of view of a student, it certainly makes writing book reports easier. Taken from the aspect of human nature, of free will, and the myriad choices facing individuals each day, reducing the compendium of creative literature to a short list of 7 basic plots, or 9 plots that you can count on your fingers, does not have to be limiting in actual writing practice. One of the overarching concepts in the study of dramatica is that all stories represent an attempt to solve a problem or to rebalance an inequity, as expressed through a potentially infinite number of characters, possible goals, and settings. Over the centuries, many people have worked to illustrate the flow lines of plot and storytelling. We are going to borrow some imagery from a short lecture given by Kurt Vonnegut several decades ago, which you can still check out on YouTube. So, here, newly updated with some titles you might recognize from the landscape of long-form and short-form fiction and literature today, let's draw a graph of the shape of stories. This line is the GI axis, good fortune and ill fortune. Kind of like the upper GI tract. Comes in good, and then, well, there's poor health, poverty, hopelessness down at the bottom, and great good health, good fortune, and happiness up on top. This is the BE axis, drawn right across the center of normal experience. As the Oracle said to Neo in The Matrix, everything that has a beginning must have an end. And here, B stands for beginning, E stands for end. Now comes the artistic part. This first line represents the most popular story ever. We start a little above the median line of contentment, and then somebody gets into trouble, causing the line to fall in the middle, and then they get out of it again by the end. For the second example, it could be a tale of young love, or almost any adventure story anywhere in the world. You set your eye on the goal. You think you have everything you need to succeed, and disaster strikes. But then you reevaluate, get determined, and fight back to succeed. Now for one of the world's favorite fairy tales that really begins a few years along in the story. A girl's mother has died. Her father has remarried a vain and grasping woman with 2 horrible daughters. Sometimes in the story the father dies too. Sometimes he just goes away on business and never returns. In any case, the girl starts out in a very dark place. There's going to be a ball at the palace, and everyone is invited. The girl gets her stepmother and 2 horrible sisters ready, but cannot go herself. Suddenly, her fairy godmother appears and gives her some beautiful clothes. The fairy godmother gives her beautiful shoes, gives her a magical carriage to get her to the ball on time because she has a curfew. The girl goes to the ball, dances with the prince, and has a wonderful time. And midnight strikes, and all the magic disappears, and the girl loses a slipper as she runs from the palace to be downtrodden again by her stepmother and stepsisters, until the prince finds her again and she achieves a Zen-like state of bliss, also known as the happily ever after, or HEA. Now I would like to add another story to the mix. It could be about a young wizard just discovering his magical powers while being relentlessly pursued by the ultimate evil and all of his wicked henchmen. Or it could be about a schoolgirl who moves to the state of Washington in a small town named Forks, who falls in love with a vampire and befriends a werewolf, has all sorts of terrible mishaps and braves the threat of death, and survives a sequel, and then, amazingly enough, makes it through at least 2 more sequels, giving us this nice pointed fang or wave pattern here. Then plummeting down when the worst happens, leaving her trapped temporarily in the netherworld between death and life, before she can safely struggle back and eventually find what we can assume will be her happily ever after, plus immortality. All these possible storylines and their variants need characters, a point of view, and a setting to help the story along its journey from beginning to end. Readers keep turning the pages of stories mainly because they are interested in what happens to the characters. Called characterization, the development of believable characters is perhaps the most basic task of the author, but writers have many tools at their disposal. Besides direct description of a character's traits, the authors can also reveal character through actions, speeches, thoughts, feelings, and interactions with others. Characters as individuals and as groups can be static or dynamic. The journey of the character, the change and growth or decay, are the crux of Aristotle's catharsis, the experience of shared identity, pity, and understanding with characters and, by extension, with our fellow human travelers in life. The point of view is often described as the eyes through which the author chooses to see the story, as well as the voice through which the story is narrated. The language used by the narrator serves to establish narrative distance, a clue to learning how closely the narrator is involved in the events of the story. There are 3 main points of view: first person, third person limited, and third person omniscient, or alternating. An example of the first person or I narrative point of view would be Huck Finn in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, or the collective we voice as in Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, or it could be the voice of Ishmael in Melville's Moby Dick or The Whale. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. Like the first-person narrator, the third-person limited narrator is a character in the story and only sees, hears, and knows what that character could see, hear, and know. This means that he or she might only have partial knowledge and understanding of the events and other characters. Dr. Watson of the Sherlock Holmes tales is a good example of this type of narrator, as is the young girl, Connie, in Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? The third-person omniscient narrator sees all and is able to comment on any aspect of the story because he or she is an outsider, not a character in the story. Readers often like to equate the omniscient narrator with the author, but it is good to remember that any narrator or point of view is a carefully developed tool and not simply the author's voice. Some stories switch back and forth between various points of view, like the horror and science fiction short stories of George R.R. Martin, better known as G.R.R.M., author of A Song of Ice and Fire, which was later adapted for the HBO series Game of Thrones. The setting is where and when a story takes place, where the conflict occurs. It is important because environment has a strong impact on what happens in a story. For example, some American stories are set in Harlem, New York, some in a ranching area or a gold mine of California, and others on a lonely bridge or in a sleepy town in the deep South. These environments not only influence the action but also the characters' attitudes. Setting can also help to shape how characters speak and behave. Sometimes the setting of a story assumes almost as much importance in the reader's imagination as most memorable characters do, like the frozen north of To Build a Fire, one of Jack London's tales of man versus nature. Plot, or the causal relationship between series of events, is the mechanism through which the action of the story is revealed. There may also be foreshadowing of a plot development, which leads to the resolution, usually delivered through a reference to an object, a place, a person, or an event, as with the shotgun in Flannery O'Connor's A Few Good Men. Both character and plot rely on conflict, and story comes from the fracture where we want two things but can only have one, where we feel two emotions, but these feelings are in tension with each other. The different kinds of conflict at the intersection of plot and character are man versus man versus society, man versus nature, and man versus self. The ultimate conflict is always interior, within the mind and heart, rather than exterior. As William Faulkner said, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. One helpful technique is to think of the interior conflict between reality and illusion. And then we lead to the conflict resolution, where the writer shows the reader that the character has either accepted or rejected the opportunity to change and grow. The theme is the underlying meaning or message of a story. A story may evoke more than one theme, depending upon your interpretation of the narrative. For example, a story in which a character struggles with a decision to lead a conventional life or seek freedom, adventure, or great wealth could be interpreted in several ways. One person might summarize the theme of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby somewhat superficially, as a tale of thwarted love. Someone else might shorten the theme to Rash behavior leads to ruin. Other readers have concluded that it is better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all would be a great theme for the story. Still others assign The Great Gatsby an overarching theme, the decline of the American dream in the roaring 1920s. Whatever theme you might come up with to help explain a story, it is important to realize that the theme statement is not the story. Authors usually don't write stories with a theme in mind. They might get an idea from a news item, which gives them an idea for a character. But once the character is alive on the page, the character may take the story into places the author never dreamed of going. And that is the point, after all. We read stories so that they will take us to places we have never been before. If, in short stories, the author seeks to write about characters who are whole, who have a past, a present, and a future, whether positive or negative, in poetry, authors frequently offer points of view, images, and language which glimpse one specific part of a whole, one instant of an event, or only a hint of an attitude or point of view. Poetry exists around the world. Everyone at some time or another is a secret poet. We see a picture, a portrait, we notice something that touches us and think, "This is something I recognize. I can say something about this." We respond to events that catch our eye, catch our soul, capture the public's imagination. Poetry can be at its most expressive when freed by simplicity and directness of speech, subtlety and beauty of rhythms, vividness of presentation, and freedom of ideas and expression. In many cases, suggestion conveys more expansively and clearly than more direct statements or descriptions. As American poet Amy Lowell noted in 1917, concentration is the very essence of poetry. Poetry is a distillation of art, its marked and measured lyrics acting as music, its descriptive words painting pictures in our minds, the overall effects of the best poems touching us as completely and as permanently as sculptures, as strongly as the winds of a hurricane, as softly and memorably as a first kiss. The art of poetry is in holding some choice, some concept, thing, or image up to the light, and helping to expose more clearly or powerfully the reality that surrounds us. This freedom of expression, of choice of focus, is crucial to the power of American poetry. No one wishes to have their sense of trust, of what is right in the world they know, violated. People want to feel safe, yes. But, perhaps even more than through short fiction, storytelling through the brevity of poetry enables writers to tear open the truths of experience. Sometimes poetry, writing, art, lets us explore the untrustworthy, the unsafe, the unsightly, the ugly and the horrible, so that we can do something to change it. And it is upon that knife's edge between the safe, the true, and the impetus to change, where some of the greatest poetry speaks and then remains in our thoughts and memories. While poets, like so many artists and scholars, may stand upon the shoulders of their predecessors, increased access to education, communication, and audiences has served to free poets' adherence to the structures and strictures of the past, unless the poet chooses to conform to a certain poetic style. In general, poetry does not hold to the meter, stanza, word, or rhyming rules of historic poetic forms, is called free verse poetry. Critics often lament that free verse poets disregarded and discarded poetic conventions like set rhymes, regular meter, even numbers of stanzas. Free verse is not, however, disjointed, nor does it utilize the abstract boundlessness of stream of consciousness writing. Instead, it is lined verse, often marked with typed punctuation, but sometimes metered by white space, shape, and implied pauses or rushing, which play with various rhythms and song forms. Free verse poetry often alludes to appearance, size, and color, rather than explicitly describing or displaying these qualities with graphic words. Not bound by rules of structure, free verse works against the ghosts and vestiges of fixed forms, and against the restrictions of conventional expectations. Free verse poetry has few rules, some would say no rules, can contain nonverbal cues through the use of evocative images, behavioral choices, eye movements, and sight cues, or words describing attitudes or emotions. As with music, sometimes the true poem rests in the silences between notes or words. As in a snowfall, each crystal of inspiration builds upon the next. One alone is beautiful, but may quickly melt. Like a snowflake, every word and every line in a poem should be as full of marvel as the one preceding and as the one following. Like a beautiful snowflake, caught and admired during a snowfall on a memorable day in the winter, a poem may take only a moment to read, but the memory and resonance of a good poem can live with a reader for an entire lifetime. Modern American poetry is generally said to begin in the mid-1800s, and contemporary American poetry nearly a century later, roughly around 1950. Two innovative poets most widely recognized in the 19th century were Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and the compendium of modern poetry in the United States includes American poets' rallying cries against racism, imperialism, and gender bias. It includes the voices of Native American poets, of immigrants, of slick city businessmen, increasingly pressured housewives, drug culture artists, and steadfast farmland bards. Throughout the evolution of the United States as a nation, ongoing social and political developments, including access to or lack of education, employment, safe housing and mobility, recreational substances, gender empowerment, and racial empowerment, affected many Americans, new immigrant and multi-generational alike. Just as social upheaval affected music, theater, and other performing arts, unrest, change, and expansion each had great influence upon the visual arts, including painting and, of course, poetry. Reversals of fortune, including outcry against Walt Whitman's elitist politics and homosexual overtones, T.S. Eliot's controversial Wasteland, and Ezra Pound's argumentative cantos, gave experimental modernism a culturally non-inclusive cast and implied strong links to conservative and even fascist politics. In response, progressive poets like William Carlos Williams, Edwin Rolfe, and Melvin Tolson rearticulated experimental techniques with leftist political and social agendas. The literary inspirations for mainstream experimental poetry contain allusions and explicit references reflecting America's immigrant history, specifically including a compositive history at once European, African, and American, and Asian, and Native American, matched by developments in the visual and performing arts. The Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven arrived in New York from Berlin in 1910 and remained until 1923. Anarchist and unconventional, Loringhoven is noteworthy for her use of portmanteau words like ice-fanged, kiss-ambushed, and others. While in America, the Baroness published scattered poems in magazines. A collection called Body Sweats was published posthumously in 2011. In the avant-garde, Surrealism intertwined poetry with the visual arts. Like Dadaism, maintaining interest in leftist politics and automatic writing, but adding an explicit commitment to unconscious motivation and dreams as a resource. Female poets of the era were frequently challenged by gender bias, and many walked a fine line between sentimentality and so-called modernist detachment. Poet and essayist Louise Bogan wrote of the importance of keeping the emotional channels of literature open, saying that to abandon contact with and expression of deep and powerful emotional streams because of contemporary pressures or mistaken self-consciousness would result in an impoverishment not only of their own inner resources, but of mankind's at large. Impersonalizing is a method for intellectualizing and managing emotions and passions through the poetic form, and is based on T.S. Eliot's theory of giving the mind precedence over the emotions in poetry. The magical science of alchemy, of transforming base metal into gold, of overcoming the baser passions and emotional drives of human life in favor of more intellectual pursuits, is one of the most influential metaphors in modernist poetry, explored by Eliot, Shelley, Byron, Matthew, Arnold, Genevieve Taggart, and William Butler Yeats, to name only a few. In her early poem, The Alchemist, Louise Bogan writes of the drives of the body, of passion as a basic human need, and the conundrum of trying to explore our capacities for self-discipline, for isolation from the emotional entanglements which both overwhelm and elevate the human experience. In the strict iambic tetrameter and truncated iambic tetrameter of the first stanza, the voice in the poem relates how she turns to the science of alchemy, of purification, to conquer the confusion of love and the grief of its aftermath. I burned my life that I might find a passion wholly of the mind, thought divorced from eye and bone, ecstasy come to breath alone. I broke my life to seek relief from the flawed light of love and grief. As seems typical when trying to transmute base metals to gold, Bogan the poet finds the flesh is stubborn, the will weaker than the power of passion, alluded to by the enjambment stressing the word still and the implied conquering of the will by passion in the second stanza. With mounting beat the utter fire charred existence and desire. It died, lo, ceased its sudden thresh. I had found unmysterious flesh, not the mind's avid substance, still passionate beyond the will. During the chaotic times of America's expansion, it seemed that people from all walks of life at one time or another felt a connection with an item, an event, or with the unknown, and many were moved to compose poetry about their experiences. Serial poetry anthologies, such as Others, helped some poetry and poets to rise quickly to prominence. Other poetry languished in obscurity. For example, a selection of 19th and 20th century Native American poems has recently been recovered and was reprinted in the 2011 collection titled Changing is Not Vanishing. Even more astoundingly, the truly unique writings of Ojibwe poet Jane Johnson Schoolcraft, who died in 1842, whose work became a key source for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha, were only recently recognized in a work praising Jane Johnson Schoolcraft for her own groundbreaking authenticity and creativity. The first known American Indian poet and writer of traditional stories, her works, including The Contrast, were recovered and reprinted in The Sound the Stars Make Rushing Through the Sky, the writings of Jane Johnson Schoolcraft. In a poem, Written in 1823, she says, "How changed, since full of strife and fear, the world hath sent its votaries here. The tree cut down, the cot removed, the cot the simple Indian loved, the busy strife of young and old to gain one sordid bit of gold." Another poet of social descent, Claude McKay, was born in Jamaica and came to the U.S. in 1912. His towering sonnets remain some of the most fearsome indictments of American racism ever written, replacing the soft-spoken romance and consolation of traditional sonnets with hand grenades of protest. A collection of McKay's poems was finally published in 2004, including these lines from his poem titled "The White House." "Your door is shut against my tightened face, and I am sharp as steel with discontent, but I possess the courage and the grace to bear my anger proudly and unbent." Between 1910 and 1940, as many as 175,000 Chinese immigrants, plus immigrants of other races, were detained and processed at the Angel Island Immigration Station located in the San Francisco Bay. Life for the detainees caught between politics, war, and economic need was strange, stressful, and demoralizing. 100 persons would sleep in bunk beds 3 tiers high, crowded into rooms of about 1,000 square feet. Though the buildings were slated for demolition in the 1970s, a worker saw the Chinese Mandarin and dialect poetry carved into the wood of building walls, and the buildings were preserved, and study and restoration efforts continue. Here are some lines from a poem written by one from Huangshan. "There are tens of thousands of poems on these walls. They are all cries of suffering and sadness. The day I am rid of this prison and become successful, I must remember that this chapter once existed." A modernist poet who also served as a medical doctor and pediatrician for working-class people, William Carlos Williams, wrote with almost surgical precision, with visualization and imagist word choices and minimal condensed phrasing. William Carlos Williams was noted for his use of colloquial speech learned while on rounds and treating his patients in his writing, and is credited with starting a truly native form of American poetry. Along with Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, Wallace Stevens, and Marianne Moore, Williams had been part of the radical group of New York artists and writers known as the Others, but his quest for flexible rhythms, use of specifically American everyday idioms in speech, and use of enjambment, the continuation of one thought and sound from one line into the next, forces readers to stop and truly see unnoticed or overlooked spaces, overlooked people, and simple objects such as wheelbarrows. William Carlos Williams, Between Walls. The black wings of the hospital where nothing will grow lie cinders in which shine the broken pieces of a green bottle. William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. William Carlos Williams wrote several famous maxims, which may illuminate the mystery of the red wheelbarrow and why so much depends upon it. He wrote, "Forget all rules, forget all restrictions. As to taste, as to what ought to be read, write for the pleasure of it." And he said, "No ideas but in things, invent," which he wrote in his poem about a snake in A Sort of Song. William Carlos Williams, A Sort of Song. Let the snake wait under his weed, and the writing be of words slow and quick, sharp to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless, through metaphor to reconcile the people and the stones. Compose, no ideas but in things. Invent. Saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks. Perhaps as a doctor living in the neighborhoods where he practiced and made rounds at the hospital, Williams felt that the ideas, emotions, and abstractions should be firmly grounded in the things of this world. We have one life, and death is always present in some form or another. Alchemy is highly unlikely in the physician's mind. To attempt to separate the mind from the body, the passions from the inspiration and experiences of life, is contradictory. And Williams splits sentences with enjambment, the way even a flower can break rocks. Language, poetry can help us break out of our personal isolation and begin to engage with the world around us. Contrast this with Wallace Stevens' dramatization of the action of the mind as it ceases to consider itself and becomes one with the scene it perceives. Beyond engaging with the world around us, beyond correspondence, we progress in this poem to identification. We see with the eyes of the snowman, hear with the cold ears exposed to the sibilant sounds of the wind. We know the cold without thought of human discomfort, resisting the urge to project human feelings onto the wintry landscape, returning to Stevens' central theme, the relationship between imagination and reality. Wallace Stevens felt that everything is subjective, something called perspectivism. It is ironic that we must continually adjust our human perspective of cold and isolation to see the neutrality of winter from the perspective of Stevens' snowman in this poem. Wallace Stevens, The Snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time, to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. We are sensory beings. We smell, touch, and taste. We see. We hear. We live in a world filled with audio and visual stimuli, from television and movies, the internet, as well as from life itself. In these days of digital media, poets are feeling more free to recite their own poems or to display them in multi-visual contexts, choosing to illustrate stories or poems by using pictures as an integral part of the written word, simply enough to force readers to listen to and truly hear the words, yet complex, elusive, and elusively enough to stimulate the reader's own imaginations is controversial. And yet, if the poet chooses to incorporate illustrations, this multisensory presentation of poetry is also valid and meaningful. Poetry reflects our everyday world back to us with unfamiliar clarity. Is poetry that art powerful enough to paint the mind's eye with images more beautiful than the physical eye may be able to perceive? Or, as may have been implied in The Snowman, are we more likely, as humans, to see the world colored by our own perceptions, no matter what language is used to convince us otherwise? How do we know that nothing is out in that snowy land? Are millions of snowflakes formed as crystals of hydrogen and oxygen frozen around microscopic bits of dust blown from all around this planet, the trees and grasses that they cover, the animals hiding in nests and lairs to escape the wind, all nothing? Another unique voice among American poets was reclusive author Emily Dickinson, who wrote 1,775 poems before her death at age 55, shut away from most of the world, but she was a keen observer of life as she saw it. She used words to evoke strong images and strong connections with the world of nature in which she felt most secure. Sometimes her words spoke metaphorically of isolation and of a different kind of emptiness. Emily Dickinson. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. Sometimes Dickinson's carefully metered quatrains spoke of the intangible, understood through the embodiment of an elusive bird. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all, and sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land, and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Dickinson's life and poetry were the very short, philosophical, almost mystical ecstasies which she sought to comprehend and compose into her later poems, sometimes with great romanticism. To see the summer sky is poetry, though never in a book it lie. True poems flee. And sometimes with explicit hints of what Dickinson, along with Wordsworth, termed immortality, Dickinson would write, "Morning is due to all, to some the night, to an imperial few the auroral light." Sometimes poetry can express a light beyond that which can be seen. Sometimes a poem isn't just a reminder of an image or event which the poet once enjoyed. Reading and really perceiving the words of a poem provides clues in which each reader finds their own meanings and connections. American poet and folk balladeer Carl Sandburg, who sang, recited, and wrote every day, praised the value of the word, the sound, and the meaning of words in poetry. In his 1928 volume, Good Morning America, he wrote one selection titled The 38 Definitions of Poetry. Among them, his views that poetry is an echo, asking his shadow dancer to be a partner. Poetry is the journal of the sea animal living on land, wanting to fly in the air. Poetry is the search for syllables to shoot at the barriers of the unknown and the unknowable. Poetry is the opening and closing of a door, leaving those who look through to guess about what was seen during a moment. Poetry is a phantom script telling how rainbows are made, and why they go away. Not every poet would choose to tune their use of words so musically. Walt Whitman is renowned as the father of free verse, but also for his sounding of the barbaric yawp, an almost palpable, powerful expression of the visceral, frontier survivor self. In verse 52 from Song of Myself, in Leaves of Grass, Whitman writes, I, too, am not a bit tamed. I, too, am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. To Whitman, the self is both individual and universal, the cosmic self, and God is the ultimate universal, the absolute self. In Leaves of Grass, Whitman explores three themes important to many poets and philosophers: the idea of the self, the identification of the self with others, and the poet's relationship with the elements of nature and the universe. In Whitman's poems, houses and rooms represent civilization. Perfumes signify individual selves. Atmosphere symbolizes the universal self. And the self in general is comprised of ideas, experiences, psychological states, spiritual insights, a spiritual entity remaining relatively permanent in and through the flux of ideas and experiences of life. We live now in a very busy world of profit and loss, joy and pain, quick lives, and sometimes even swifter death. Poets still deal with the themes of self, of life, of death, for adults and for children. More than half a century after Whitman wrote of his barbaric yawp, Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss, wrote Horton Hears a Who, published in 1954, about Horton, an elephant, who is the only being capable of hearing the minuscule Who people, right up until the moment of preventing the destruction of their entire society. At that precarious moment, little Jojo Who reaches beyond himself and beyond the restrictions and conventions of society to escape annihilation while unnoticed on a small flower by yelling with all of his might and causing all the people of Whoville to yell, "Yawp!" thus saving their lives. Seuss's hearkening back to Whitman's cry for recognition can be viewed on many levels, from the context of post-war Reconstruction to the dismissive isolation of the status quo and the domineering compulsions of racism. Writing a children's book composed in anapestic tetrameter, 4 anapastric metrical feet, each foot with 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, sometimes also referred to as a reverse dactyl, Seuss's verses seem more like stories than poems or commentaries on life. But reading the driving meter of his lines has something to offer adults as well. "This," cried the mayor, "is your town's darkest hour, the time for all Whos who have blood that is red to come to the aid of their country," he said. "We've got to make noises in greater amounts. So open your mouth, lad, for every voice counts." Thus he spoke as he climbed. When they got to the top, the lad cleared his throat and he shouted out, "Yawp!" Audre Lorde was a black writer, feminist, and civil rights activist, and the New York State Poet Laureate in the last year of her life. Her poets ring with technical expertise and emotional expression, voicing love, hunger, and hope, as well as deep anger and outrage at civil and social injustices which she observed throughout her life. Lorde's poems and prose touch on issues related to civil rights, gender, feminism, and the exploration of the black female identity. In Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches, Lorde wrote, Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. Looking at 3 very brief examples of Lord's poetry, we can see the strong use of language, the meter being variably determined by word length and spacing upon the page, as well as her sporadic use of rhyme and repetition. Audre Lorde, Now. Woman power is, black power is, human power is, always feeling my heart beats, as my eyes open, as my hands move, as my mouth speaks. I am. Are you ready? Separation. The stars dwindle and will not reward me, even in triumph. It is possible to shoot a man in self-defense and still notice how his red blood decorates the snow. Love, maybe. Always, in the middle of our bloodiest battles, you lay down your arms like flowering mines to conquer me home. A poem's ambiguity can be its greatest asset, whether it is metrical rhyming in black verse or in some other form. For humans communicate through words, but we understand through the imagination and connections drawn within our innermost selves. Sometimes words and illustrations can evoke other concepts, other connections. Our meditations over art, literature, and poetry can change our outlook and bring us beyond our current understanding of the world. Authors of poems and short stories write to express memories, feelings, experiences, to explore relationships and value systems, to imagine a different kind of world. Some people write because they think that no matter how corrupt government, business, or media may become, music and writing can still be wonderful. It is what helps us help everyone else get through this thing called life. When we write, when we read, we see these worlds. We enter the lives and universes which writers have created. And it is in imagining, in reading, in forging a connection with the images, concepts, and values which have been written, it is in the confluence of words and thought that we reach understandings with ourselves, with the world in which we live, and with the lives we share.